All right, good morning. We're going to take up the transportation elements first, which is the addendum, circling back on that, and then we're going to proceed into the sector plan recommendations. So, Glenn, why don't you start us off?
I'll be really quick. Chris Conklin's provided you a response, Mr. Reamer, to your question about what's going on in the way of safety improvements around the Germantown portion of this plan. They're in circles 1 and 2. And you can go through this, he'd be happy to do it. The issue that's sort of come up is since the last work session, actually, and DOT sort of signaled this back then, was that there's concern that there may be a problem with the road diet on Middlebrook Road, ultimately, in terms of whether or not 4 lanes will work. Not now, but in the longer term. And so what they've done is they've worked with Park and Planning staff and developed an interim cross-section, which is on Circle 5, I believe, 6, which would reduce it to 4 lanes, but would not change the curb-to-curb section. The curb-to-curb wouldn't disrupt the curbs, is what I'm trying to say. And then if things do work out over time, you still can keep it at 4 lanes and reconstruct it entirely. We'll just turn over to Chris and to Laura Hodgson to talk about this some more.
Thanks.
Good morning.
Morning.
I won't go through all the details of the road safety audit implementation unless you're curious about those measures, because I don't want to take the time. In terms of the road diet, we had done analysis of road diet to implement pedestrian road safety audit measures on this quarter, and we were identifying problems with queuing back through the Germantown Road intersection. That modeling is by no means comprehensive. It was just to look at a tactical solution. So what we would suggest to you is that if you're interested in this road diet, that this be considered as a facility planning project in the next update of the CIP. And our main concern was that if we find that we can't implement the road diet here because of these queuing issues, which ultimately create other safety problems at upstream intersections, we would want to have an opportunity through this plan to implement things like the cycle track, buffering sidewalks, and other measures while retaining the 6 lanes. So since the last work session, we've met with the planning department and have talked through what could be done as immediate measures, which are implementing conventional bike lanes on Middlebrook Road, which would be consistent with what is on Middlebrook Road just south of Great Seneca Highway.
Conventional bike lanes, so not buffered?
They wouldn't be buffered because there isn't the room within the existing section. We would evaluate the opportunity to go to this short-term strategy that's in your packet, which is the buffered bike lanes. If it's found through the modeling exercises so that it's just not going to be viable, we would look to narrow the section further, look at taking width out of the median, and realize more space to buffer the bike lanes. Again, that would require some reconstruction. We would have to figure out the cost of that type of project. The language in the planning department's memo covers the sorts of things that we would want to see, which are just providing the opportunity that if the 4-lane section isn't viable, that there is an alternative in the appendix of the plan for how it could be implemented while retaining the 6 lanes. So that's what we have in front of you in this packet.
Planning comments here?
Laura Hodgson, for the record. We agree with them. The planning analysis that we do is at the master plan level is primarily at the intersections. And although our analysis from the consultant shows that the capacity on the roads is there for reducing the lanes to 4 lanes, we don't do a queuing analysis, and that's something that was typically done in facility planning. So we agree that probably additional analysis is necessary to, as we look towards implementation, just to make sure all of the T's are crossed and I's are dotted so that it goes smoothly for implementation. There are a number of assumptions that go into a master plan model also for the future, so we would want to double check that those assumptions are correct. Based on the back and forth with the planning board, there's slightly more density in the long-term scenario than we've currently suggested to the council. So if we marry up the density that is finally approved with the model and a few other assumptions, that we may be able to make things work perfectly, but we need to just kind of go through the process and make sure everything's finalized.
And just to reiterate, A master plan is a vision. A lot of the detailed analysis that Chris and Laura have talked about is not done at a master plan. It's done when you actually start through a CIP project designing a facility. The master plan vision, and I think DOT agrees with this, is still for a road diet. We would want a road diet. We would strive to see if a road diet works, but we're suggesting essentially a backup plan that if it isn't possible when that detailed analysis is done, that there are some other options.
Okay, I'm just trying to get
Completely
clear.
agree.
Oh, go
I
ahead.
completely agree with Ms. Wright.
So the interim, so you're suggesting a facility planning process, and until then, you would stripe a bike lane?
That's what we could do without adjusting the curb lines, and it would buffer the sidewalks better and make it a more comfortable corridor. That's very short term. There are other things in a more, 5-year timeline or that could make improvement upon that, but that's the very first step towards
Okay.
addressing this
So,
issue.
so you couldn't put up the bollards in that kind of a
Now,
temporary
once
bike facility?
there's really not enough room to buffer it.
Because you need
We
some
need a
space
couple
from the
more
lane
feet.
to the,
Right.
to the bollards.
Right,
And if you were to shrink to 10 feet, you're
Right.
going to be right up against it.
correct. So with the facility planning process, we could identify midterm and long-term solutions here that would improve upon that base condition.
Andrew?
Thank you. I was going to say something similar to what Ms. Wright just said, which is, I think it's important that we're practical and that we are, transparent about what the realities are, but we shouldn't miss the forest for the trees. The idea of a master plan is to create the forest that we would want, and there's obviously, near-term challenges with fulfilling that, and we need to make sure that we do it. But could you just explain to me, my recollection of the intersection is that 6 lanes on one side and 4 lanes on the other, and my impression as we talked about it was that we would basically be going 4 lanes and 4 lanes through the implementation of a road diet. I don't need to go into the long details of every aspect of it with the other intersections, but could you just explain what summarize what the challenge is that you're trying to address?
Yeah, no problem. That is correct. North of Germantown Road, it is a 4-lane section. It widens to 6 lanes at Germantown Road. In the work that we were doing to implement the road safety audit recommendations, we were finding that in the longer term, the queue from Crystal Rock Drive extended back through the 118 intersection and actually quite a bit further back than that, affecting other locations up that corridor. That modeling is very preliminary, but it gave us pause to say we should look at this more closely before we start to implement the road diet here. We absolutely support the road diet as the vision for this corridor. I think it should be the primary alternative in the master plan. There are other ways that we can look at the modeling, such as reducing the capacity of this road to 4 lanes to see if that diverts traffic to other alternative routes and allows it to be implemented. But none of that work has been done, and what gave us pause is that if we call for the 4-lane road diet in the master plan, we find that it's not feasible, and we haven't detailed the expectations that there might be a larger footprint alternative here. Then we've lost an opportunity to gain the types of improvements we want to see realized by the alternative, and we're sort of just swimming without a roadmap at that point and what we would implement here.
The other thing is you shouldn't think of, just because the road is 4 lanes on one side, that it should be 4 lanes on the other, because the traffic at the intersection is a lot of turning movements. For example, northbound on Middlebrook Road going westbound, making a left turn on 118 heading towards Clopper Road, there's a double left there because there's a heavy, very, very heavy volume making a left there. I believe there's only 2 through lanes going from that intersection going north to the northern section. So it's essentially a break point in that part of Middlebrook Road. It becomes from more of a local street to more of a regional street at that point. So
I appreciate it. I said it at a previous meeting, I'll say it again. I think we've got to find a way to view failing intersections with safety as much as throughput, looking at safety on an equal footing as efficiency, and that's for every user of the intersection. But I understand that there are near-term challenges of getting us to where we want to go, but I would hate to lose the long-term vision of road diets being an effective way to resolve some of these challenges.
All right, so we'll proceed with a facility planning item. My only hesitation is, will people use the striped bike lane? It's such a highway there, but I guess it's
It's
we'll set our expectations
and
appropriately.
it's not going to get the use the buffered bike lane would get.
Yeah.
That's for sure as a bike lane, but it does pull the traffic away from the sidewalk.
I
Which
think
is a
it's
benefit.
beneficial on that
Right.
from that perspective. So I
And
think
the good news is it can be done very quickly. So we're
Yeah.
talking about sort of short, mid-term, and long-term. The short would be simply striping the bike lanes.
Yeah.
The midterm is what's on Circle 6. That requires a little bit more work because it requires changing the width of lanes, putting in a median, doing things that don't really exist today. The long term could be more like what's actually in the plan as the road diet, dependent on what the modeling shows. And again, I want to emphasize also one thing that Laura just said, which is the next part of your work session, you're going to be talking about some land use and zoning changes. Those are the inputs that go into a model to decide if the intersection is going to work or not. None of this is immediate. This is all sort of modeling
to that
future.
point, Quinn, the Germantown master plan calls for like 100,000 jobs up there that I don't know that very many of them are there. That's all in the inputs. When you look at the queuing, is it including the scenario that all gets built?
It includes a long-term scenario like that. Then, like I said, there's a myriad of refinements that would have to be done to confirm the right approach here.
And in the
Exactly.
zoning, you're going to be talking about what we've really tried to do, I think, is be very realistic and sort of right-size a lot of the zoning recommendations. So that may have a positive impact on whatever modeling ultimately happens.
Okay. Good. Well, I think if we explain the bike lanes just as much as pulling traffic away from the curb to improve the safety feeling for pedestrians, I think that would be helpful. Thanks very much. All right. Now we'll turn to the zoning recommendations.
Hey, good morning. I am done for the record. I'm just going to give you a little background on the plan area just to set the stage for listening to the land use recommendations. As you've realized listening to the transportation components and issues, you know that Boys it's small, it's rural, and it's unincorporated with a population of about 2,000 people. Germantown is a large unincorporated town with a population of almost 89,000 residents, about 9% of Montgomery County. So very different in scale and size, but they are linked together by the MARC train. The purpose of the MARC Rail Community Sector Plan is to promote a range of safe transportation alternatives, recommend improvements to the existing transportation systems, and support better connections to the MARC station areas that respect the residential neighborhoods and the historic resources of Boyds and Germantown. The MARC Rail Communities Plan recommendations are organized around 4 overarching planning principles: connect, renew, preserve, and sustain. For each principle, the plan provides a series of goals and then associated recommendations for fulfilling the plan vision. Some recommendations are area-wide, while others are specific to a particular property or location. Under the planning principle of connect, you've reviewed the stuff with Dr. Orland about transportation connections, PHED, bike, all of it. So that was covered by Dr. Orland. I'm going to cover the recommendations under the planning principles of renew, preserve, and sustain. So renew is the first section we're going to cover, and the first goal is to promote compatible infill development around the Boyds and MARC stations while protecting existing residential uses, historically significant structures, and natural features. And this starts on page 67 of your plan, if you want to turn there. To implement the goal, the plan recommends preserving Boyd's historic fabric and rural village character to preserve the community's historic function as a gateway to the agricultural reserve. This broad recommendation is followed by 6 bullets that provide greater guidance for implementation. I think all of the bullets that support that implementation are fine, except there is one that recommends retaining existing uses throughout the Boyd plan area. And 20 years is a long time to retain uses. I think that it would be better if we just simply change the word retain to support existing uses and similar uses. Retaining suggests that if even a new use that was allowed in the zone but different than there today could not be allowed, even though it might be compatible. So just soften that language up and just use support existing or similar uses. Otherwise, staff supports all the other recommendations under Goal 1 for Boyd's, and also for Goal 1, all the recommendations for Germantown.
Okay.
The second goal is to promote compatible, walkable, and context-sensitive development that supports the Boyd's and Germantown MARC stations while protecting and reinforcing each community's scale, character, historic character, and sense of place. And staff supports the recommendations made with respect to this goal for Boyd's. For Germantown, the first recommendation under this goal is to ensure that new building heights and transitions between building heights are context-sensitive and compatible with Germantown Historic District. All right, this recommendation is followed by 7 bullets, each one providing some detailed text related to height. And in all but one case, those bullets really just provide the same information that you get from the height that's allowed under zoning. It just says allow up to the height that is zoned. The one that provides sort of a difference from what you'd get under zoning is a bullet that restricts height across from the MARC rail lines in the historic district for the Rollingwood apartments. And in that location, across from that part of that property, the property is vacant or it's filled with trees, the right-of-way width there is only 60 to 65 feet, and we have height compatibility standards in the code that would pretty much do what this one section of the plan is recommending. So staff thinks that the broad language is useful for planning. It's good for the vision. It helps when a project comes forward for review. You could leave in the language about context-sensitive heights and stepping down when you get close to historic resources, but I would remove the bullets that refer to all of the height in feet. It's basically done through zoning, and even the one piece that differs a little bit from zoning is covered by the height compatibility within the code.
Any comments on that planning? Is that okay, or?
I don't think certainly we understand that some of these things are handled by the zoning code. If it's consistent with the zoning code, sometimes it's helpful to actually put it in the master plan, because there are people who read the master plan but don't always read the zoning code as thoroughly. Sort of belts and suspenders kind of a thing, but we don't feel super strongly about this.
Belts and suspenders, Pam.
Well, to me, I think sometimes those things can cause confusion. I think if you have the height in the zone, which is what we're pretty much used to now, in the zoning code rewrite, heights are now listed by property, and people know that to do anything on a piece of property, not only do you have to be consistent with the master plan, but you have to be consistent with zoning. If you were to keep the bullets, there's an error on one of them, so you'd have to correct that. And again, I would take out the bullet that refers to a restriction on height that is basically covered by height compatibility in the code, and it's not really clear where that starts and stops. The maps are very general in detail.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I guess I'm inclined to leave it in there, although I understand, but it just feels like your average resident should get a picture of what we're talking about here without reading the zoning code.
Absolutely, and I think that the broader language does that, the language that basically says the things that I think are actually what the reviewers would have to follow and what they would look for compatibility in addition to zoning is the language that I'm recommending that you keep, which is ensure new building heights and transitions between buildings are context sensitive, compatible with the historic district, transition building heights along Waters Road, Germantown Road, Walter Johnson Road, and Wisteria Drive from higher to lower heights to ensure compatibility. All that would stay.
Okay.
It was just the bullets would come out, because that specific of
Okay.
allow building heights to step up to 75 feet, that part of it's in the code.
Okay, that's good. That way, then, if we were to want to do a zoning text amendment affecting heights, we
Right.
wouldn't have to then change the master plan.
Right.
Well, would you take the map out then, figure 54?
I would.
See, I don't know, I feel like,
If you
That-
wanted to put a map in that said zoning heights and put in them heights, the problem I have is where it says 60 feet in height, this is figure 54 on page 78, and in the middle of that diagram, you have 60 feet in height limit, and this does not match the zoning, where you have the bump out in the yellow at the bottom.
Okay?
so I think the plan was actually suggesting that the heights, even with the language that it needs to be compatible, they were giving some suggestions as to what compatible might mean, in that the 60 feet of height should continue a little farther than the zoning might allow it to.
But the point is that one bump out in piece where it says 60 feet in height should be what you look at. The zoning height there really is 90. It perfectly matches up the Rolling Wood Hills apartment complex. It is across from a piece of property that right now has an industrial use on it, although it is zoned, I think it is residential. And because the height compatibility, when you are across a right-of-way, doesn't have to be a roadway, the right-of-way could be the railway, of something less than 80 feet, actually I measured it, this is 60 to 65 feet in this location, it would have height compatibility standards that are very respectful of the fact that while currently today it's vacant, and has an industrial use that's closer to the MARC station, if it did have something residential eventually, the height compatibility would kick in, like it does for everywhere in the county when you have a residentially zoned property.
Yeah, I think I'm a little concerned about the idea of it being a suggestion and then having specificity. It seems to me to be somewhat incongruent. Unless we call it a suggestion, I think we have to be really careful of what the map exactly looks like before we have to get into an issue of having to amend the master plan, which seems to be setting us up for something that we wouldn't want. So I'd be inclined to agree with staff. And I think in many ways it's we're trying to get to the same place here, so
Exactly.
it's somewhat of a distinction without a difference, but at the same time, I don't want to, this isn't a contentious
No.
discussion, to be honest, but I think it also just may set us up for an issue down the line. At least that's my read of it currently.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. I'll just say, as being involved with actual regulatory cases, I will tell you that the discussion about what is a compatible transition, what isn't a compatible transition, sometimes becomes very heated, and it helps to have some stronger language in a master plan that the regulatory reviewers can hang their hats on. But again, we don't feel super strongly about this. We don't know of a regulatory case that's coming in the immediate future for these properties. But I will just say that sometimes, again, and we went through this actually in excruciating detail in the Bethesda plan, talking about, exact heights, because there was a lot of concern about what is considered compatible. And we knew that the zoning code has lots of provisions to assure compatibility, but still residents wanted more, more information. Again, it can go either way. I do hear you about the idea that the map could be a little difficult if the development that comes in doesn't exactly follow this boundary. That could, in fact, in some ways, to that degree, I would keep the bullets and not the map.
It's complicated. All right, so how do we bring these together here, Pam? I thought we were heading toward, you were saying that the map could be changed that's in there, so that...
Yeah, I would prefer taking them both out, the map, because you don't think you need it. If you go to the zoning map, which is on page 87, and you'll see the zoning. And when you look over at the symbols that represent the different areas that are zoned, you'll see that the zone on a map, and if you go to the, the zoning map that's online and you click on a property, this will come up. It's the height will be right there. It's the last thing listed. My concern with the map that shows the heights on the previous page is that part where they show a 60-foot height across from the historic district, but it's not clear where that runs. It runs in the middle of that Rolling Hills apartment complex. It doesn't run along a boundary line. It doesn't run along a road. It's difficult to know really how far back it goes. I'd be inclined to take the map out and the bullets, just to be, clear. We want compatibility. We want protection.
You're saying you think the map's too general? Like this?
The
Because I
map-
think it was
the map
intended to be
back
that
on-
way.
The map back on 78.
On 78, right.
Right.
I mean, which I think
Right.
was the intention of a basic overview, but I think is your concern that it being so general doesn't,
I'm fine if it were
reflect
to
the
match
fact that the
up with
property-
zoning was what I was trying to indicate. So the map on 78 in all respects matches up to zoning and property boundaries and the way things have been zoned by area, right, in the different colors. The only place that it doesn't is where it has the 60-foot height limit in the middle, and that comes out onto the Rolling Hills apartment. And from this map that is very generalized, there's no roads, it is within that Rolling Hills apartment. We don't know
think-
how deep it goes.
Yeah, you're saying the map, if anything, is too general, not specific. And I think what we're saying is where you see that little L-shaped yellow piece, that's the 60-foot height limit, that would, by zoning, be 90 feet. Where that little L bumps out on the 60-foot height limit, it would, by zoning, be 90 feet. What the plan is actually trying to communicate is that even though it says on the zoning map that that area could be 90 feet, we think because of compatibility with the historic district, that corner should be no more than 60 feet, and it should then step up. And that's what that's what we're trying to communicate with the little L-shaped part, yellow part on the map, as well as with the fourth bullet.
can we write that? Because, I mean,
And that's
I
what-
think that's a very laudable and important goal, but I didn't see that here. I mean, I
Well,
understand that's what your
bullet
intention.
4.
And so what I will just say is that in doing that, you'd need more specificity about how far back do you expect that to go, because it's not clear at all from the map or the language. Is that 100 feet deep? Is it 50 feet deep? Is it 20 feet deep? And we have compatibility standards in the code already that would protect that portion of Rolling Hills apartment already. They are less than 80 feet across the right-of-way to the historic district at that location. So I think it's redundant. I'm not against it. I just think it's unclear. If that property wanted to redevelop, I don't know that they would understand exactly what they were faced with.
So I think maybe a middle ground would be to take out the map, because I sort of do understand what Pam's saying about how that yellow L is somewhat arbitrary and was just sort of drawn in. And maybe on the fourth bullet, where it says the western side of the Rolling Hills Apartments property should have heights limited to 60 feet due to its proximity to the Germantown Historic District, but may step up to 90 feet near Great Seneca Highway. Maybe that we could add a sentence saying 60 feet in the area that is across from views to the historic district or something.
But if you look at the outline, Gwen, of the historic district boundary itself
is a little farther
is a
to the
little
west.
farther right. It doesn't actually line up with the Rolling Hills apartment. And where they really are across from is just residential housing that's very narrowed lots that are like 300 feet deep. I looked online. Those lots are so deep, and they back up to the track. So the houses are hundreds of feet away from the railroad track up into the neighborhood. I don't know what you achieve by it, but I mean, if you don't add the sentence, you want to leave a general bullet, you'd have to if you want to leave all the bullets, you have to change under the second bullet. It references site GH. It's actually GI. GH is referenced down under bullet number 5.
All right. Okay, Pam,
Just
I
think it's
agree with you.
confusing. Okay.
And
You're in support of taking all the bullets out and the map?
So, well, the only thing that I would say in terms of the bullets, I think that reflecting the goal, which is, a height restriction respecting the historic district, I think we have, the issue is it's a little bit over, and I don't know how you put that into language, but I think that the planning is right in terms of the intention here. I think the question is how that is reflected in the plan, and I agree with Pam that perhaps this doesn't do it.
Right.
But if there's,
I think
maybe
the
we could
broad
just direct to
language does
find.
give you direction. The broad
Okay.
language does tell you that along these certain roadways, you want to respect and you want higher heights that go to lower heights to ensure compatibility with the Germantown Historic District. I think that the general goal of that whole section is laudable and it should stay, just don't agree with the specific bullets.
are you suggesting that we should not have heights generally in master plan language and leave that to the zone so that?
I would do that. I would
That be a
leave
different approach from what we've
language
done in
that
the
doesn't actually
past?
reference a number, right? That like this section, this recommendation A, if you just got rid of the bullets, you'd still have recommendation A. It still wants you to be respectful and compatible with the historic district.
So to Gwen's comment earlier, under this philosophy, if we were doing the Bethesda master plan in accordance with that approach, we would have not specified certain heights in the.
I'm not
we
familiar
would have
with
put it in
the plan language, so I can't
zone.
tell
We would have
you.
put it.
So, it really is, to some degree, a question of what is the purpose of a master plan. And a purpose of a master plan is to certainly set a vision. It is also, though, to, I think, provide clear information to both residents and people interested in developing property. I think our fear as staff is that if someone came in to develop the property that's in the brown that says 90-foot height limit on figure 54 without that little yellow notch, and they see that it's 90 feet of height, and they see that, yes, they are across from residential, but, Pam actually just made some great arguments. I could hear them saying, but the houses are set really far back, you don't have to have.
But zoning doesn't recognize that. Zoning doesn't recognize how far the house is set
Right.
back. Zoning recognizes that it's residential land that's
Right.
across from that.
But the regulatory process would say, they would perhaps argue we can have a very, very small area that's lower and then step up very quickly. I think that the goal is to protect not just the area literally right across from the historic district, but sort of the views to and from the district. And this map doesn't explain the topography. There's lots of height, of hills and dips. And I think that the goal, again, was to try to create the vision that we really did not expect 90-foot tall buildings sort of in that general view shed of the historic district. And again, I sort of agree about the map because I can see where we would be on a regulatory case arguing about exactly where that little yellow L-shaped line is, and that isn't our intent. But that maybe we could come up with, if we keep the bullets, add a little more clarifying language to bullet 4 about the intent, and we could, again, work with council staff about that prior to the full work session. I think that bullet 4 is the key bullet, and I think that, maybe explaining the intent a little more clearly would be helpful.
Well, so as a compromise, I would recommend maybe getting rid of the rest of the bullets because they are completely identical to what you would say in zoning, which is they basically allow building heights up to 100 feet along a certain road, and that's exactly what the zoning does. In that location, that property is zoned with 100 foot in height, and it allows heights up to 100 feet. So like the last bullet, so some of them are redundant. I don't know that they add more clarity. But the fourth bullet, if it's rewritten without the map, could stay with recommendation A, and I would get rid of the rest that are basically repeating what the zoning is.
Okay. I have,
Mr. Reamer?
Yeah.
If I may, Fred Boyd, Area 3 Planning Team. There is another, forgive me, sort of philosophical reason here. The zones are designed to implement the recommendations of the master plan. We have now a much more crisply defined set zoning regime in which with very specific height limitations. It seems to me that you would use language in the master plan to point to the implementation. So the master plan recommends a specific set of heights or an area of transitional heights, which are then reflected in the zones that are set down later in the plan in the implementation section. So from my sort of organizational perspective and the perspective of generating the vision, my idea would be that you would point in the body of the plan to the heights you would like to see in specified areas, and then reflect that vision, if you will, Mr. Friedson, in the implementation section through the specific sets of zones.
all right, well, I think I'm going to go with Pam here, so do you agree, or?
Yeah, that's fine with me. I do think that we should at least have the fourth bullet, and we can rewrite it, tweak it if we think it needs to be tweaked, because I think that the goal is the important piece here, which is to make sure that there's respect to heights vis-a-vis the proximity to the historic district, which I think is where all of us want to end up here. So
That sounds great. Okay, so we move through the packet. With respect to this goal, the other goals in this section for Germantown, recommendations with respect to the second goal in Germantown, staff supports all of those. The third goal is just to establish a network of attractive parks, public spaces, trails, community gathering places in Boyd's and Germantown communities to provide space for recreation, social interaction, while enhancing the beauty and environmental quality of both communities. And the fourth goal is to provide high-quality schools, community facilities throughout Boyd's and Germantown, and all of the supporting recommendations for those two goals for both Boyd's and Germantown, council staff supports what the planning board has recommended. The fifth goal is where we move into zoning. So the last goal under renew is apply zoning to support the land use and recommendations. And for Boyd's, the zoning recommendations are on pages 82 and 83, and there's a map on pages 84 and 85. And the plan recommends zoning to support the historic and rural community character of Boyd's, consistent with densities in locations that are outside the water and sewer envelope. Council staff supports these recommendations. For Germantown, the zoning recommendations are on page 83, and the maps are on pages 86 and 87. And the plan recommends zoning to support the historic and residential areas of Germantown and allow compatible redevelopment. And there are recommendations for the area that is north of the railroad tracks, and staff supports that. There's one recommendation near the Mark Station in Germantown. It is for the Pumphrey Matini House. It is GF on the zoning map. Bring that up. It's located within GF. There are the two Mark Station parking lots are also within GF. But the plan recommends replacing a CR zone, CR2, C1.5, R1.5, and a height of 40 feet with a commercial residential neighborhood zone of 0.75, C of 0.25, and R of 0.75, and a height of 60 feet to reflect the recommended land uses, heights, and densities in the plan. But if you look at the Pumphrey Matini House and you calculate its current FAR, its current FAR is a .27. So if you zone it to a commercial, and it's used commercially, so if you zone it to a .25 commercial, you've made it non-conforming to the zone. I would just suggest we bump it up to .5 commercial. Like, leave it commercial residential neighborhood. The other attributes of the zone are fine. It's just we don't want to create a situation where a property becomes non-conforming. And its current FAR for commercial is .5. So it's
Okay.
not really a change.
Thank you. Sounds fine.
Clarification.
The second zoning issue in the same location in GF has to do with the MARC station parking lots. And there was a recommendation to change the zoning from CR to CRN. CRN does not allow structured parking. It's a commercial residential neighborhood zone. They don't really want structured parking lots in the zone. And while they are public, and if the county came forward with a project, it would be a public project. Those are allowed in every zone. But to approve or to at least recommend compliance with the mandatory referral, the planning board's required to look at the zoning and does it meet the intent? Does the use being asked for meet the intent of the zone? And if structured parking is not allowed in the zone, it'd be hard for them to say, yep, they think it meets the intent. So I just suggest to go from CRN to CRT.
The chair has been working really hard to get MARC expansion, so we're hoping for structured parking there, and we're hoping for expanded use of MARC, so I'd definitely be in support of that, because I share the chair's goals here, and we want to make sure that we're sending not just, what we're allowed to use, but the vision. We've talked previously about this when we discussed this master plan. We should be sending a message to the state, and we should be sending a message to CSX, and we should be sending a message to the public that this is a policy goal of ours. And so I think that, while a small change, I think it's a symbolic one, so I certainly support that.
Yeah, just to continue, how flexible does this plan work if MARC is indeed turned into more of a commuter rail? Does this plan account for that in your opinion, Pam?
Well, the zoning changes that
and by commuter rail, I mean, obviously just much more service.
Right. Do they allow for the construction of structured parking to support that
Yeah, and
vision?
just generally, is this plan sort of a status quo with tweaking the land use based on more or less status quo with MARC, or is this plan contemplating what we really want from MARC, which is to be much more of a commuter rail, constant service, and ultimately even running in through DC and into Virginia?
I will let the planning staff answer that. I see much of the vision as looking at the area as a historic district and being concerned with potential things that might make that not feel so historic. It does allow for the structured parking. It actually calls out for that and re-recommends it from the 2009 plan on the surface lots that is closer to 118. In my opinion, it leaves open this idea that the surface parking that is the one that we parked the bus on when we took the tour, that one stays a surface lot. That one has not been recommended for a garage. For a second garage, they look at the possibility that it could locate on private property that is north of Bowman Mill Road. That's the suggestion. A second garage, if needed, should be north of Bowman Mill Road, which that would be great as long as we have private property owners there that are willing to do a structured parking lot for MARC. I'm not sure that they are. So I'll let them.
Yeah, I think that we absolutely did take into account the vision of MARC as a commuter rail station, and the zoning for, again, I think that Pam was talking about some of the properties closest to the MARC station, but the planning board spent a lot of time talking about the properties at GH, GI, GJ, and the idea that those all are properties that have the potential for redevelopment to create more housing near the MARC station, and that as that redevelopment happens and those properties have to provide their own structured parking for redevelopment, that there would be opportunities to provide additional structured parking that could support commuters. I do think that, as we looked at each of these properties, including all the way up to GK and GL, we really were very cognizant of the fact that the idea was to create opportunities for more housing near the station so that people could use it as a way to commute, and to do as much as we could to co-locate things that would be services for the MARC rail station and commuters along with new development.
Okay, so commuter rail, you did envision big expansions of service.
Absolutely.
And I think, Mr. Reamer, you'll find that the recommendations in the immediate area also incorporate significant potential for additional residential development, which would certainly be able to take advantage of increased service for MARC rail. One of the challenges we had in this plan was the issues that we were mindful of from our analysis of the 1989 plan and what had actually happened. So one of the goals of this plan was to make certain adjustments, reality-based adjustments, if you will, to focus perhaps a little bit less on non-residential office development and perhaps a little bit more on providing potential residential development in the immediate vicinity of the station. And I believe that the plan did accomplish that.
Okay. Great.
Okay, moving forward. So there's a final recommendation that has to do with zoning, and it is a reconfirmation of the Germantown mixed-use overlay zone that prioritizes the use of building lot terminations in the optional method of development. And staff supports this. It's the basic overlay zone. But I would note that in Germantown, the overlay zone requires 50% of their incentive density be purchased with BLTs, where in other parts of the county, except for in the Life Science Center zone, it's 7.5% of their density. So maybe something to look at in the future. If we don't feel we're getting enough non-residential development in Germantown, is it possibly being affected by that really high BLT requirement?
What does that translate to in terms of dollars?
One BLT is worth around $250,000. So if you had a property that required one, you had a 2 FAR, then I think 0.75 of your density would be required to be purchased with BLT. So that's almost a full BLT. It would cost you well over $200,000
For
that requirement, just to be
Yeah.
able to move forward.
okay.
So just,
Seems like
we don't need to
something-
solve that today.
Right.
It's just something to think about for the future.
Go ahead. Yeah, any
Yeah,
comment?
sorry. I was just going to say if Ms. Wright or planning could comment on that.
No one has made use of it as far as I know. And has
It's a requirement, so,
has there been a regulatory case where someone has bought their density with BLT?
yes, Century.
Okay.
I didn't do regulatory for Area 3, so I
Yeah.
don't remember, but,
Well, Robert
but there are,
Mm-hmm.
and Robert could come up, that there are properties that have come forward with non-residential development, and, they have to purchase 50% of it. It's a tall order in that location, in that overlay zone. Just something to think about.
I have to say, I haven't been that familiar with how that overlay zone has been used. I know we really haven't had a lot of non-residential projects in Germantown, but I haven't chalked it up to that overlay zone.
Yeah, it's on all FAR, actually. Sorry if I misspoke.
It's commercial and residential.
Commercial and, yes, sir. Richard Weaver from planning staff.
So commercial and residential, when do they have to go to the zone?
They have to acquire their BLTs when they hit the optional method threshold. So we anticipate they're going to be doing some residential development, and then when the commercial comes online or comes in, they'll have to seek BLTs to get above the 1 FAR.
Residential or commercial?
Residential
To
or
get above
commercial.
1 FAR?
Well,
yes.
it's 0.5 FAR for CR, and if they're in CRT, it's 1. So it just depends on which zone you're in.
percent.
CRN doesn't have optional method.
And this is unique?
This high requirement is unique. It's in Germantown. The Life Science Center zone also has quite a high requirement. And I think part of that evolved because when the BLTs were first created, I think the Germantown plan was underway, and it was a way to really think about how do we really spark this program, Life Sciences Center, at the same time. And just over time, we've learned more about it. So the general CR zones require 7.5%. Just something we could look at, or planning staff could look at in the future. It just evolved.
So, but go through the mechanics a little bit. So if you were to want to do more than one FAR, or a half if you're in the CRT, CR, which there isn't a lot of CR here, is there?
In the small part that you're looking at for
Well, I guess there
the
is.
historic district, there's some. Oops, of course I can't see.
All the purple is on page 87.
Yeah.
So but
They don't have super high densities, but they do
Yeah.
have some that are at 0.25.
1.25.
So, and I actually guess if you have it's above 0.5, right? So if you wanted to do
And
your
it's
maximum
above
density of
0.5.
1.25, 0.75 of your density would be purchased with a BLT, which is 75% of $250,000.
Is that how it works?
Mm-hmm.
Is one BLT is one FAR essentially, 1.0? I mean, how do you,
Well, no,
how many BLT, how do you know how many BLTs you have to buy, or how's
so
that
you look at
calculated?
what your incentive density is. So the example here is if you were in like 1.25 is your total FAR, and if you wanted to maximize that, 0.5 of that you get under standard method. So you take that away, it leaves you with 0.75 FAR.
Right.
So you would then have to use BLTs to purchase,
How many do you have to buy?
actually at that case, then it's only 50% of 0.75. So it would be about 37% of your density.
But how many BLTs does that translate to? That's what I don't understand.
It would be a partial. So, and the county actually buys BLTs from farmers and holds them. So your Department of Agricultural Services then is a place where somebody in development that doesn't have to purchase a whole BLT from a farmer goes and purchases a partial. I'd
So is
have
it
to look at the
basically
math more
all of your
carefully.
incentive density is considered 100% of your BLT requirement, and then as much
50% of it.
and then as
Sorry.
much as you need to purchase, it becomes the fraction of that. So if you want to purchase 50%,
Well, no, you have to purchase 50% of your incentive density as a BLT.
right?
Right. Just to compare, I was just bringing up the conversation because, elsewhere in the county, it's 7.5% of your incentive density. It's just a very different game, and I think that we should look at, the planning department might want to look at eventually, is that an issue in Germantown or even in the life sciences? Are we not getting the...
I'm sorry, maybe I'm just a little slow this morning, but let's say you only wanted to use a fraction of, one developer wants to use all of their incentive density and one developer wants to use half. Does one developer have to purchase a lot more BLTs?
Yes.
Is it multiple BLTs or is it just a fraction? It's always one BLT and then it's just how much less than that based on how much less of your incentive density you want to purchase. Is that basically how it works?
That's close.
That's pretty, it's just, without the right words in the right places.
Yeah, you have to purchase some amount of a BLT based
Got
on
it.
what you're developing.
So it's some amount of a BLT.
Yeah.
That's
I mean, if
the
you have
clear-
a very large development, and I don't remember how large Century was, and if it's very large, you could be purchasing more than one.
Right.
We have had the case, yes.
That
But
wasn't
generally,
Century,
it's
yeah.
a fraction of a BLT that you're
It can
having to
be.
purchase.
Yeah.
Can be,
And
yes.
for these size developments, $250,000 is not an enormous cost of a public amenity, even if it's a full BLT.
Right. That's why I was asking, exactly. I wasn't clear if you were saying, and you have to purchase 7 of these. That's one thing, but a fraction of one is,
How many did Century?
Century had to purchase will have to purchase a number of whole BLTs and some fractional pieces of BLTs.
and Century is, what is encompassed in the Century development?
I don't remember the size of the development, but it's under construction right now, and there's a few hundred townhouse and multifamily, and a few 100,000 square feet of non-residential commercial.
Commercial, a few 100,000 square feet of
I
commercial.
believe so.
Those are big
Office.
development.
It's a big project.
Okay.
I'm just still a little confused with the 50% versus the 7.5%. I mean, that's a massive gap, and I think that was the initial purpose of it being flagged by council staff.
Right.
I mean, so I think that, I mean, I think it's important for us to know what the real cost is that we're talking about, but it's also, you know, I think the conversation that we ought to be having, if not today, then
Right, not today,
at some point, is the 50% versus 7.5%, and whether that's appropriate, because at the end of the day, regardless of what the cost is with this particular type of public amenity, the question is that the appropriate cost, and are there other public amenities? I mean, there are lots of different ways to get
Right.
to public amenities, and, you know, the question is this serving the best interests of the community there? Or there are other public amenities that we could be, you know, frankly, extracting out of this type of optional
Sure.
method development, right? I
At the
mean,
time that that this was created, BLTs were sort of the new hot thing, and so they were a focus of the plans that were happening in 2009, 2010. That was when Great Seneca Science Corridor also happened, and there was a lot of interest in doing the most we could to get BLTs. That seemed to be a priority. Priorities may have changed, and we can, have a conversation about that. I think it probably should be done in the context of looking at the whole BLT program and just sort of seeing where that program stands at this point, and that might be a project to take up
Yeah.
in the fall.
Well, I do think we need to look at the BLT program. We've had some conversations about that over the last couple of years, because there's not as much funding there, I think, as many people would like. We can consider whether we want to take this up. I mean, I don't know. I suppose the rationale was to ensure that the ag reserve, which is proximate to Germantown, is protected. And
Of course.
so it was something that was considered of special importance to Germantown, and that's why. So, yeah, and Great Seneca.
yeah, I think it would be good to look at this at another meeting, you know, and really zoom in on it. But I think that it's important. I think that we do the ag reserve a disservice by just viewing the adjacent communities to the ag reserve when we talk about, you know, TDRs and BLTs and, you know, the transfer of density, because, you know, the whole purpose is to preserve agricultural land and to focus density and intensive development in areas that we believe, as a matter of public policy, is more appropriate for environmental reasons, for smart growth, land use reasons. And so, you know, I think that we ought to be thinking more broadly about this than, at least from my perspective, that there should be drastic differences, because it's of greater benefit to people in Germantown to have a strong and thriving agricultural reserve versus people in Bethesda or in Wheaton or Silver Spring. And I happen not to have that view. I think that it's of tremendous value to everybody in the county to have a strong and thriving agricultural reserve. And so I think figuring out how we look at the program and make sure that we are reflecting that viewpoint, at least from my perspective, would be helpful.
All right. Well, let's take a look. We're going to have to take it up, I think, because of the budget, and we can, you know, keep looking at that and come talk to us about what a review of the issue could be.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yep.
You know, we just went through huge swath of master plans, and in none of those master plans did we consider changing the BLT requirement. You know, but at the same time, it's worth just doing a reminder and a
Evaluation.
debrief and an evaluation to guide the next set of master plans that we'll take up. Thank you.
Okay, the next part of the plan that we'll be reviewing is under the Planning Vision Preserve. The first goal is to retain, restore, and rehabilitate historic resources that contribute to the historic fabric of both communities. In the Boyd's Plan, there's a recommendation for retaining the 1927 pedestrian underpass. You'll recall that we saw that when we were on the tour, and in Boyd's, we looked down, it had been blocked off, I guess, for repairs and flooding at the time. And there's this recommendation is followed by 3 bullets that provide greater detail for this implementation. One is to provide improved lighting and flood prevention, possibly with a canopy. Another would be to incorporate ramps and wheelchair lifts to make the underpass ADA compliant. And the third is to just provide sufficient funding for maintenance. And I thought the committee might want to consider just using the term "to the extent feasible" with the bullet regarding the ramps and wheelchair lifts. Obviously, that would be awesome if it could accommodate everybody, but in the redevelopment of the station area, it may be found that there's a preferable ADA compliant alternative to crossing the tracks. And I'm not sure if that's true or not, but the language is pretty strong that it must incorporate, if it's to be retained, wheelchair lifts and a ramp. So just something to think about to make that a little less strong, but planning staff, if they feel strongly that it should not be.
Okay. So what are we talking about here? What is it? What would it take to build that? What's the idea? You're envisioning a superstructure over the tracks that has elevators and takes a person up over?
This is under. This is like wheelchair
you're-
lifts and ramps to go down to that underpass and to
If
make
you
that.
remember when we were out at Boyd's,
Yeah,
there is that very deteriorated underpass.
yeah.
And it certainly isn't ADA accessible. And there may be alternate ADA compliant crossings, and we have no objection to adding the words "to the extent feasible." I think we just have to, again, once you actually get into the design, see what is going to be possible. I don't think we can actually work out that level of detail in a master plan, but the vision is to create a train station, a stop that has maximum accessibility.
Is the idea that the private sector would be building this?
No.
So this is all government. Aren't we subject to ADA already?
And it's a question of, again, how you might do the ADA. Do you actually try to do ramps down to that underpass, or do you try to come up with something that is an alternative? Again, we don't know yet what the right design is, but I think what we're just trying to say that it would be really great to improve access at the Boyd's station, and that to the extent feasible, we should put in those kinds of facilities.
It's fine.
Yeah, to the extent feasible. Okay.
Okay. And then staff supports the other recommendations that were under this section, as well as the ones for Germantown. If we move on to sustain, that was the last sort of planning vision. There were 3 goals: to preserve and enhance the area's natural assets and tree canopy, including designated best natural areas, protect and restore the area's water resources, and acknowledge the area's unusual geology and its influence on the area's natural character and the constraint it imposes on development and infrastructure. And with the recommendations for these goals, council staff is fully in support of all of those. The 4th goal is to manage infrastructure and utilities to ensure responsible growth, preserve community character, and safeguard public health. And for Boyd's, it was noted in the plan that the goal is to continue to serve the area with individual well and septic treatment. And then the plan also notes that the Department of Environmental Protection, in its 10-year comprehensive water and sewer plan, categorizes Boyd's as a septic system problem area due to ongoing system failures, and recommends that Boyd's be added to public water and sewer service. This is followed by a second recommendation in the plan that if community sewer service is needed to safeguard the public's health, it should be limited to the residential and institutional uses that are along Hoyles Mill Road and White Ground Road. And I just thought it would be interesting to know if we thought this would have any impact on the broader redevelopment of the Anderson property, which is the primary thing that I think the Boyd Station has to look forward to, is the recent acquisition by MCDOT of that property where we had parked the bus and were looking at the big mill. And also was submitted as part of the testimony for this plan. A huge sort of charrette was done and a redevelopment of this area that might have a community facility. How the limiting, if there is a future need for water and sewer, limiting it to these residential and institutional uses that are far from this property, or how they see this property being able to fully redevelop if it has a septic failure. That's it.
And I think that is a great catch, and we should probably add on page 95 that it should be to the properties on Hoyles Mill, White Ground, and the Anderson property, which serves as the Mark Rail station. I think we did not intend to exclude that and say that that property should never receive sewer service if it needs to. It has a septic field now, but if the area around it gets sewer service, we would definitely support that historic building getting sewer service that might end up being a station building or some other use. So I think the idea would be to just add it in,
So the idea is not to exclude from it, but not
to specifically add it.
promote community sewer, and, which could have implications on sprawl development and some of the things that we're specifically trying not to be moving towards, right? So we got to, as long as we're striking that balance of not excluding these, particular properties, which is focused and targeted, and not expanding it to sprawl development,
Whole
which is
area,
not what
yeah.
we're interested in doing in this area.
Just that property. That concludes, that's it.
Okay. I had a quick question, just on the historic district. So page 25 has the Boyd's Historic District. Just wanted to confirm. So all the houses, the single-family houses that you see on your way out to the Boyd Negro School, those are all in an historic district, and they're eligible for property tax credits, or are they all considered to be contributing resources, or is there some sort of variation in that, or?
There may have been one property up closer to the Presbyterian Church that might have been considered non-contributing, but really most everything else is considered a contributing resource.
Okay. Good. To me, it feels like a very important historic district that it really just captures a sense that a lot of historic districts, I don't know, to me it's very unique in Montgomery County. You go in there and you know exactly what history you are encountering, and including there's an edginess to it that I think is very interesting. So just wanted to make sure that those property owners were eligible for the tax credits as well. All right, Andrew, any other comments? Okay, I think that wraps up the land use zoning. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you.
Thank you, planning. Appreciate your work on this. And that concludes our committee meeting. All right, thanks.